I'm not going to be, basically I'm going to have a lot of verses up on the slides, and I'm not going to be reading any of those words. You've got eyes and the ability to read, so you can read while I talk, because I'm trying to cover a fair bit of stuff. So you can read what's up there, and I'll be summarising it as we go. All right, so bit of context. This is kind of a bit of a Old Testament Bible timeline. You can see there kind of entry into the Promised Land with Joshua on the far left-hand side and moving through, I suppose, effectively the Israelite adventures. So what you see is you've got end of Judges. I suppose you've got the books kind of lined up with their chronological timelines. In Judges 13 it says, "And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. Interestingly, I didn't realise this, that was about 400 years after, so they entered the Promised Land. So you can see Joshua starts around 1400-ish BC, and you've got the end of the book of Judges is about 1000 BC-ish. So they've spent 400 odd years trying to conquer this Promised Land, somewhat successfully, somewhat unsuccessfully, often because they did things like evil in the sight of the Lord. So Samson's the last judge that's mentioned in Judges, and he was a bit of a loose unit. Interesting when you read the stories about Samson, he doesn't seem like the kind of person you'd be going to for advice, maybe. Didn't seem like the leader of people. He kind of did his own thing. Certainly fought against the Philistines, but he was the last judge mentioned in Judges. And right at the end of Judges it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." And then the next book we get to, Ruth's in there, kind of in parallel timelines, and then we get to the books of Samuel, hopefully. It worked once. There's a magical mouse over the magical PowerPoint clicker thing. It's all locked up. I'd tell jokes, but my family would leave. All right. Oh, there we go. There we go. Winning. Thanks, guys. All right, so the origins of Samuel. So this is, the book that follows on. So Pastor Paul touched on this, so I won't go into really any detail. Basically, his mum had been unable to conceive. She poured out her heart to the Lord and said any child she had would be dedicated to the service of God. And the Lord blessed her with a child. And at about the age of 3, they took that child to Eli, who was the high priest at the time, and basically said, "Here's our child from God. Can you look after him and teach him, the ways of the Lord?" So here we've got, so Eli had sons as well. He had 2 sons, and they were not particularly good. And then he had Samuel, and it says that Samuel's parents visited Eli each year, and they were then blessed of the Lord with another 3 sons and 2 daughters that the Lord provided Samuel's mum. So at some point in his childhood, there was a man of God visited Eli. There's really no other description of who this person was, and basically said, "Your sons are no good. Bad things are going to happen to them, and I'm going to basically put someone else in their place to take over after you." And just an interesting point you've got there in verse 35 that's up there, uses the word anointed. And that's a very specific term that's quite unique to the story of Samuel in terms of that word, anointing or anointed. So you can see that Samuel, in that last verse, Samuel had a strong connection to God. So Then we've got a story, I think we all know this one quite well from Sunday schools and various talks. God calls Samuel. He thinks it's Eli and goes in to see Eli. And Eli says, "It's not me. Go back to bed." Then God calls him again, and he goes and wakes up Eli again. And he says, "No." And he twigs it might be God, not just voices in Samuel's head or some weird imaginary friend that he had. So he says, "Next time God calls you, talk to God." And God calls him again and basically tells Samuel that Eli's family is going to be judged because of their iniquity, that they're not doing good things, similar to what the man of God who'd visited previously said. And he basically said, this is how it's going to be. And then the next morning, Eli says, "Hey, Samuel, what did God want?" And poor little Samuel basically has to tell Eli that his sons are duds and bad things are going to happen to his family, which, this isn't often in the Sunday school stories and pictures you see, like Samuel's a toddler kind of running around. Josephus said that he was about 12, and it makes more sense that he's kind of old enough to actually convey a message with a bit more, I suppose, more of his facilities about him, especially that kind of message. It also talks about Eli running when he hears the voice, and it means he wasn't a teenager because they don't run when they get woken up. So there's a bit of powers of deduction on that one. Below about 13 or 14 from my personal experience. And then, so you got Samuel growing up, becoming a prophet, working alongside Eli, who was noted as quite old. So following this, there's a large battle with the Israelites fight the Philistines. Someone should count how many battles there are between the Philistines and the Israelites through Samuel. They seem to be teeing off every second week, and it's amazing there was anyone left alive to fight after a number of these kind of battles, just the number that they had. But basically, they had a big battle with the Philistines. They lost that one. And the Ark of the Covenant is taken, and Eli's sons are killed. Then there's basically a runner from the army, runs back and tells Eli what's happening. When he hears the news of the Ark's capture, he falls off his chair and dies, which you can read there. Interestingly, it's not because of hearing his son's deaths. It was the hearing the Ark was captured that the Bible notes as the reason that he fell off his chair. There's also a bit of a cheeky jab at him being a bit fat because he says he was heavy, and that's kind of why he broke his neck. So Samuel maybe having a bit of an in-joke with Eli on that. And Eli was both the high priest and a judge in the Bible. So just because Judges, the book, finished, doesn't mean that Judges stopped existing. So there were still judges that still carried on post that, the book of Judges. Eli was one of them. So then Samuel takes over as fundamentally judge of Israel. While the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant, God played some games with it and tormented them. And in the end, they gave it back. They said, "This thing, something funky with it, you guys can have this back. It doesn't work for us." It wasn't worth the trouble in having this thing that they'd taken as a great thing of conquest that it just caused them trouble. So Samuel, they get it back. Samuel then commissions the people, basically, as he's taking over, and basically says, "Let's follow God and only God. Let's do things the right way." And they said, "Yep, that sounds like a good idea. We want things to go well." And so then Samuel became the judge, their prophet. He was also noted as a seer and a priest, so pretty much ticking all the boxes for important things that someone could do back in those days in terms of leading the people and working with God. All right, so Eli had sons and they were duds. Samuel also had sons and they were duds. I'm sure you could say the logic is all sons are duds. Based on that small sample size, that goes back to Matt's and Curtis's talks down at camp about not using just snippets of stats to make a decision. So not all sons are duds, but these guys definitely tick that box. And it's not uncommon in the Bible or in life. Hereditary succession is often not a great plan. You can watch some of the joys the royal families had over the years to justify that. But just because dad's good at something doesn't mean the kids are going to be good at the same thing. They might be good at other things. it may not be ruling a country. So basically the people have become disillusioned that Samuel's getting old, his sons are duds, we don't want them and they were judges, it says, over the people, but they were not good ones. And the people basically said, we don't want these two clans looking after us, give us a king. And interestingly, they said, we want a king to judge over us. So basically, it was the same role that they wanted done, they just wanted him to have the title king. So it didn't really make sense what they were hoping to achieve by putting a person in place as a king instead of having a judge under God. They still wanted the same outcome, but with a different job title. God was choosing judges independently. You hear about various judges being called. He was choosing them because they were the right person for the job. The joys of a monarchy is it's a hereditary system, so you just get whoever comes next. You don't get to pick them, doesn't matter whether they're good or bad, you're getting them, whoever they are. So again, they're signing up for a somewhat flawed system. God tells Samuel that basically the people are rejecting God, not Samuel. It wasn't because he was doing a bad job, and we cover that a little bit later. It's because the people had basically kept turning away from God, more so. And it wasn't Samuel's leadership as such. Samuel goes on to tell the people it's a bad idea, the king's going to make a mess of things, and the people say, that sounds awesome, let's go with that. Because people aren't always smart. There's a few interesting parallels there for things like where Pilate attempted to have Jesus released and said, hey, there's this good guy over here, I can set him free, or I can set free this murderer. And the people go, hey, murderer sounds great. It's the same thing here. They're being told that the king's going to make a giant mess, and the people say, that sounds great, let's do that. It's fundamentally God's plan, and the people are doing what people do. All right, now we jump to a guy called Saul, who's noted as being a big unit and a good operator in modern terms. The kind of guy you want to, lead your army into battle, And so this Saul, basically the story starts with Saul's dad had a heap of donkeys and they ran away, as all good stories start. And basically he was told to go find them. So he's on a donkey hunt, walking around the villages, looking for these donkeys for a few days. And they can't find the donkeys. And he's got a mate with him, and they come to a town where Samuel was known to stay. And basically, you can see, I think in that second verse it's there, basically, let's go see Samuel, he might be able to help us work out, he knows things, he can see things and tell things. Let's go talk to Samuel, hopefully he knows where the donkeys are. At the same time, God told Samuel that the chosen king of Israel would come across his path, basically. The next day, basically, both of them are walking through town. Samuel sees Saul walking through town, and he goes, that's the one. It might be because he was, a foot taller than everyone else he could see, or there might have been something special about him. But Samuel basically sees him and engages with him. They have dinner, and Samuel then privately anoints Saul, basically saying he didn't make him king then, but he anointed him to say, you will be the next king. After that, Samuel lays out a series of events that will happen to Saul, basically in the next day or two, as a sign that God would basically be with him and that he is the chosen to be king. And it also says he'd be turned into another man. And these things come to pass. There were some strange, very specific things that Samuel says. They all happen. And it says that God gave him another heart. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and Saul prophesied. So generally wasn't the thing Saul did, but he prophesied for a period. So after that, Saul becomes king formally. Samuel starts by telling the people yet again that choosing a king is a rejection of God. God was in charge of you. God was your king. You've now chosen a man and kind of put God to the side. He talks about all the things God's done for them, and then they kind of present the tribes one by one. So the tribe of Benjamin comes up, and Saul's family was part of that, and they're presented, and there's no Saul. And they get a bit worried, and it turns out God tells them that Saul's hiding in all their stuff back at camp. So someone goes and finds Saul, who's hiding, they drag him back, and he becomes king, which is a pretty strange thing, that you'd start a effectively a ceremony to make a king without actually having the king there. But that's how it happened. Samuel follows God's commands, even knowing that it was going to fail. He doesn't at any point say, "This is really dumb, God, let's not do this. How about you stay in charge and we ignore the people?" So he follows through, essentially fires himself. He was the judge, he was ruling Israel. He's basically handed in his resignation, or fired himself, while anointing Saul and making Saul king. So it's a strange thing to do, to be in charge of something and basically hire your own replacement, even though you weren't looking at replacing yourself. So he reaffirms Saul as the king, and then Saul leads an army into a victory over the Ammonites. After this, Samuel gives the people a bit of a going over yet again, and it basically says, "Can you guys confirm that I've been a good judge, I've judged you well, I've judged you rightly, I've been good, I've led you in God's ways?" And the people say, yep, you've done all that, no problems. And he's kind of going, "Well, what do you need a king for if I've done all this stuff right?" In as many words. He basically says, if you and your king follow God, things will be good. If not, things will go bad. And the people say, "Awesome." And then, as a bit of a exclamation mark at the end, Samuel calls on God, who sends a giant thunderstorm and freaks everyone out. Just to put a bit of the exclamation mark on the end of, "I've told you this is a bad idea. God's the one who's in charge. God's the one you should be following." So after that, this is, I suppose, the beginning of the end for Saul, and he's not that far into things. About 2 years in, it says. There was basically an army of the Philistines had approached, and they were getting a bit worried. Saul had been told to wait for Samuel, or told by Samuel to wait for him to get there for sacrifice. Saul got a bit worried and basically ordered that there was a sacrifice to be undertaken without Samuel being there. When Samuel arrives, he basically tells Saul that was not right and that his kingdom will end. That ordering that sacrifice in contradiction to Samuel's orders was what fundamentally put the first nail in the coffin for Saul's leadership. And he gets told that that God had chosen another man after his own heart. And that's where Saul's, I suppose, dynasty was terminated at the great order of one generation. It would end with him. Interestingly, God, when he was talking about Saul, it said he would give Saul a new heart. When he chose David, he said David was a man after his own heart. So David already had the heart to some extent, but Saul was given the heart. And I don't know whether that played into some of the decision makings that went on with the choices those two gentlemen made. So this is, again, a very well-known story. They went and had a fight with Amalek, and Saul brought back a whole heap of stuff he wasn't meant to, including the king. And that disobedience, as mentioned on the previous slide, that wasn't what cost Saul his ruling, but it certainly put sealed the deal. Who knows whether that was a test for Saul, that whether he'd done that properly, that God might have said, "Okay, you've done this right, here's another chance," but fundamentally, that's all hypothetical. He did the wrong thing, and it just reinforced he's not the right man for the job. And you'll see that, Samuel here, the second last verse, he hewed Agag into pieces. So Samuel wasn't mucking around here. He finished the job that Saul hadn't done in terms of disposing of the Amalekites utterly. Also shows he just wasn't a boring priest sitting up in a temple somewhere. And after this, you'll see in the last verse, basically Samuel stopped supporting Saul. He didn't go see him anymore, didn't help him anymore. He basically cut him off, which ties into, interestingly, in 2 Corinthians 6, talking about not being unequally yoked together with unbelievers. That's obviously Samuel went, "You're not listening, I give up on your own," and went about his business. All right, so these are the next verses that come straight after the previous slide. So basically Samuel's sitting around a bit upset that it's all gone pear-shaped, even though we knew it would. And God says, "All right, mate, that's kind of done. Let's get on with the next one." God's got work for Samuel in terms of setting up the succession after Saul. Saul's dangerous at this point. He's a bit angry, humiliated. His rule's been condemned to end. So God it's actually quite funny if you read that first section of verses. God comes up with a sneaky plan that he wants Samuel to go find David, but they're worried that because Saul's been told that basically Samuel's going to go find someone to replace him, that Saul might have people, following Samuel or watching Samuel in case if he anoints someone, Saul can keep killing that guy and no one's there to take over from him. So they kind of come up with a plan that he's going to take a cow and go sacrifice it to the Lord as his kind of cover story for finding David. So Samuel meets up with Jesse's sons, and basically the Lord tells him that basically each one comes up and he goes, basically God tells him, no, that's not the right one, that's not the right one, that's not the right one. They run out of sons. Samuel gets a bit confused and says, is this actually all your sons? They go, oh no, there's another one out the back in the fields. So he said, well, maybe that one might be good. Can you go get him? They go get him. That's David, and I suppose we know what happens there. He becomes anointed of the Lord. And we've got, it's a very hierarchical society, even more so back then. The oldest, it mentions that the oldest son, was a good-looking young lad, and for him not to be chosen, and for the, basically the youngest kid in the family to be chosen, that tipped the whole system on its head. That to have a youngest child again ruling, you saw something similar with Joseph and the mess that made with his family. When the person who's not meant to be in charge ends up in charge. But there's no real mention of family angst in this case, and the brothers. They suggest maybe he's not the right person to fight Goliath, but they seem to generally get behind him. And also, the whole family was put at risk by this. By David being secretly anointed, their whole family was now a target for Saul, until David was made king, which was not kind of weeks, months. This was years later that David finally became king. So the whole time they had to keep this secret that David had been anointed for the sake of their family. So there's a bit of... So interestingly, when Samuel was looking at the brothers, the Lord says, don't look at the appearance. And then you'll read in that first set of verses there, that we're then told that David had a beautiful countenance and was good to look at, which seems to kind of contradict what God was telling him to look at, and that's the thing that's recorded. It didn't actually say David was a good bloke or, devout or committed to God. It says he was a good-looking unit. So I suppose it just goes back to the way people, we're very driven by the outward, not the inward, in what makes an impact. But and it says God knew his heart. He said, I'm going to pick someone with a heart that is right. And God knew what he was doing there with David. So David gets anointed. From there, there's a heap of stuff that happens between chapter 16, where he's anointed, and chapter 19. David kills Goliath. David marries one of Saul's daughter, or the other daughter, not the one he was meant to at the start. He married the one he actually liked. So I suppose that worked out well for him. Saul starts throwing sharp things at David. David and Jonathan become close mates, and at some point David gets sick of sharp things being thrown at him and runs away. And basically goes and he knew where Samuel was, and he basically went and hid with Samuel at this place called Ramah. Saul hears or is told where David is, goes to find him, and yet again, so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul again. A few interesting things happen, and then he prophesies a second time. So he prophesied when he was anointed, just before he became king, and then at this point in time, he also prophesied, and there was it seemed like a bit of a joke about Saul becoming a prophet that's mentioned a few times in the Bible. So that's so David gets away while Saul's prophesying, and the story continues. We then jump, 6 chapters, and the next mention of Samuel after this is a pretty innocuous kind of ending being recorded. Didn't fall off a chair, nothing exciting happened. It just says Samuel died. So there's not really anything recorded. He was very old, but that's the end of Samuel. So interestingly, you'll note that that's the end of 1 Samuel, which raises the question, how did he write 2 Samuel? Because he's not there anymore. So other people have obviously, and it's generally accepted, that Prophet Nathan, who has a lot to do with David, and another prophet called Gad, were noted as being other people who were recording things at this time, and it's highly likely that they contributed to 2 Samuel. But yeah, Samuel did not write 2 Samuel, I'm pretty sure. And interestingly, Saul is still king when Samuel dies, even though all of this stuff's gone on and he said David's going to replace you. Saul is still king and ruling when Samuel dies. I've just put the verse there from 1 Samuel 27. So that it indicates that bits of the book were written a fair bit later, because there it talks about the kings of Judah. And the kings of Judah didn't exist if you looked at that timeline. The kingdom didn't split till hundreds of years after, when Samuel was there. So you've got an interesting note there that someone's added that little tidbit. It might be they were compiling notes from from Samuel and Nathan, but the book of Samuel as it stands was obviously compiled sometime later. So don't worry, I won't keep going through all of 2 Samuel. But that's not the end for Samuel. Comes back for a little cameo appearance. Saul basically is starting to freak out a bit later on in life and goes to a witch, and Samuel, or some representation of Samuel, is raised from the dead by this witch at the direction of Saul as he's seeking guidance. And Samuel basically gives him a quick history lesson, tells him God's left him, and him and his sons will die soon. Saul and his sons did die in a battle a bit later on. So a few takeaways. So we've got Samuel. He was a very dedicated servant of the Lord. He judged truly and well. There's kind of not any recorded slip-ups, I suppose, from Samuel. One of the few people in the Bible that doesn't seem to mess up something that's recorded. He was humble and not self-serving. He replaced himself as ruler. And when he was the judge over Israel, he didn't argue with God about making a king. He replaced himself when that was God's direction. He was a mouthpiece for God through his life, never shying away from the hard discussion. He told people, good, bad, or indifferent, generally bad, that they weren't doing the right thing. And the people recognised his service and righteousness. He's mentioned in Hebrews 11, in the list of some of the, I suppose, heroes of faith. He really served God, and and what he achieved and how he achieved is something to, I suppose, aspire to in terms of just being a dedicated servant of God. And I'll leave it there. And we'll move into a time of prayer. So